emulation, where I want you to imitate what you see. I want you to see examples and say, by God's grace, can I be like that? Today's lesson is for you to see what not to do. And that makes it a little bit tough. Because on the one hand, I don't want to completely ruin John Wesley for you. All right, as we'll see briefly, God is going to use this man in remarkable ways. Going to be one of the great evangelists, theologians, and preachers in the history of the church. On the other hand, he had a horrific marriage. Maybe the worst marriage I've ever studied. And so we're going to try to learn lessons about what not to do if you want a healthy relationship. And that's a little bit challenging. All right, that is negative examples. We have to pay attention to make sure we're getting the right themes, but I'm going to do my best to explain it clearly. My theme verses may give a little hint to where we're going. Proverbs 21:9 says, "It is better to dwell in a corner of a housetop than with a brawling woman in a wide house." So you live in a big house, and this woman just will not stop, and he moves into the attic to get away from her. But it wasn't far enough, because you go down 10 more verses to verse 19, and it says, "It is better to dwell in the wilderness than with a contentious and angry woman." The attic wasn't sufficient. Now he's out in the desert to escape this contentious woman. Well, Proverbs has a great deal to say about godly women. It's not anti-woman. In fact, wisdom is personified as a woman. And there are a lot more verses in Proverbs about bad men than there are about bad women. So don't take those verses as somehow being anti-woman. But they do suggest that in a marriage relationship, there are some serious pitfalls. And John and Molly Wesley, unfortunately, are going to illustrate a lot of them for us. Now, this is a new PowerPoint, but I've been telling this story for a few years. And I always want to preface it with, you can tell this story in such a way that we just basically cry for the next 40 minutes. Or you can tell it kind of in a lighthearted, might as well laugh rather than cry. And so I'm going to opt for that second approach. And they're both in heaven. Nothing we can say will hurt them. All right? You want the crying one? Feel free to cry as I go. There will be plenty to cry about. but I'm going to smile as I say it. All right, so let's start with John Wesley. John Wesley grew up in a Christian home, as we'll say more about. And as a student at Oxford, he became very serious about Christianity. Let me put it that way. In fact, as a grad student, he gathered other young men around himself, including his younger brother Charles, who was 4 years younger than he was, George Whitefield, who was 11 years younger than he was, and a number of other young men. And they became known as the Holy Club, which they didn't pick that name for themselves. It was kind of a derisive term. But they were serious about reading the Bible and lengthy periods of prayer and visiting people in their homes and giving alms to poor people and visiting the jails and reading scripture to people. Almost every member of the Holy Club is later going to testify that when we were doing all that, we were not doing it because we were saved. We were doing it to earn God's favor. They were doing it as religion rather than relationship. And then in 1734, at the age of 31, he decided to go to Georgia as a missionary. Georgia was this debtors colony, Oglethorpe and all that. And he thought, this will be an opportunity for me to minister. And on his way there, he met some Moravians who were passionate about sharing their faith. They would have loved that video, seriously. And these Moravians, during a storm at sea, were just super calm. And Wesley was like, "How can you guys be so calm?" And they said, "Well, we know Jesus. If we go down, we'll be fine." And he arrives in Georgia, and he writes in his journal, "I have come to America to convert the Indians, but who's going to convert me?" And he has 3 miserable years there. But the Moravians impressed him, and when he got back to England, he attended a Bible study on Aldersgate Street in London, heard the preface to Martin Luther's commentary on Romans being read about justification by faith alone, and he felt his heart strangely warmed, and he got saved. Over the next few years, over the next 40 years, he is going to travel about 250,000 miles on horseback. He's going to preach about 42,000 sermons. He's going to publish more individual pieces of Christian literature than any other writer in church history. He's going to inadvertently birth a denomination. That is, he wanted the Anglican Church, the Church of England, to be revived, but at his death, 79,000 people pulled out of the church and founded the Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, if all you know are United Methodists who are wealthy and have a downtown church and don't believe anything, these early Methodists were nothing like that. I mean, they had an overemphasis on free will, I think, and they thought you could lose your salvation. But they were passionate about evangelism and holiness. And John Wesley was the founder of all of that. He is one of the most important evangelists, preachers, theologians in the history of the church. And so we're a little surprised that 4 years into marriage, he wrote to his brother and said, "Love is rot." That is, it wasn't going well. So how does it happen that you find yourself in a really horrible marriage? Well, let me back up a little bit. One of the things that causes it is not being shown a good family dynamic. Now, I know you've probably heard good things about Susanna Wesley. She was a remarkably disciplined lady who made sure her kids got family devotions and chores and a lot of good habits, and it was a very large family. But the marriage between Samuel Wesley Sr., who was a pastor, and Susanna Wesley, his wife, was challenged. Let's just put it that way. They were married for a long time. Samuel was the rector of a very small country church, and he was frustrated almost his whole life that as a man of letters, a man who felt like he knew Greek, he knew Hebrew, he knew theology, why am I stuck in this little parish church? And every chance he had to hang out with the London pastors, he would go hang out with the London pastors, but he was always there in Ipswich. And they didn't pay him a very good salary. He was constantly struggling to pay his debts. And in fact, at one point, he was put in debtor's prison for 3 months as the pastor of the town. That's not a great testimony. And then he's married to this woman who is amazingly strong-willed, skilled, manages the home with an iron hand. And perhaps the best way to illustrate this dynamic is a I think, funny story that comes from just before John was born. John's going to be born in about 2 years. But one night, Samuel was praying in the evening for King William because King William had gotten very sick. This is William of William and Mary. They had taken the throne in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and the Stuarts were finally gone. The Stuarts were all terrible kings. And now William and Mary have passed an act of toleration. Things are better under William and Mary. And so he's praying every night at the evening meal in front of the older children for King William. And at the end of the prayer, Susanna refuses to say amen. And he confronted her about it. He says, "Wife, why are you not saying amen?" She said, "Because I believe King William is an imposter and the Stuarts are the rightful rulers." And there was, in fact, a living Stuart at the time, King James's daughter Anne. And she says, he immediately kneeled down, and this is no doubt in front of the kids, and imprecated the divine vengeance upon himself and all his posterity if ever he touched me more or came into bed with me before I had begged God's pardon and his. That would be quite a dinner meal scene. Well, King William died just a few days later and the problem was solved. Right? But they had a tense relationship at times. That is, you get the picture of a man who's frustrated and not as strong as he should be, and a wife who knows exactly what the answer is to every question. She said at one point, "Since I'm willing to let him quietly enjoy his opinions, he ought not to deprive me of my little liberty of conscience." Well, that's a sentiment that's fairly common in the 21st century. This is 1705. I mean, this is a long time before women are saying, "I have the right to my opinion, thank you very much." She later said, "It is a misfortune peculiar to our family that he and I seldom think alike." Well, I don't know how peculiar it is to their family, but that's the environment that John grew up in. In fact, John was the 15th of 19 children born to Samuel and Susanna Wesley. 10 of those kids lived beyond infancy. That is, they had 9 miscarriages or infant mortality. John became very close to his mom. Part of that is because when he was 5 years old, the parsonage caught fire. And the family was hustled out. There was a lot of them to hustle out. And then they're counting heads, and where's John? And John was still in his bedroom, which is an upstairs room. And the fire is engulfing the place. And they throw ladders up there, and they get him out just in time, and John survives the fire. Susanna at that point said, John is a brand plucked from the burning. God has big things in store for him. And while she invested in all the kids, she very much invested in John. And in fact, John's going to inherit her personality. He's going to be way more like Susanna than he is like his dad Samuel. He's going to have the scholarship of his dad, but the personality of his mom. And for his sake, John is going to revere his mother. In fact, when Samuel Sr. dies, she's going to move in with John and live with him until her death. And John is often going to say, I doubt I will ever find a woman to match my mother. Young men, that's probably not a great sentiment for you to express. Whatever you're thinking, keep that to yourself, all right? The old compare with mom thing is not a great idea. So John, with this very strong kind of driven personality, has the first love interest of his life when he's 25, which by the standards of the 18th century was kind of late, but he falls in love. Her name was Betty Kirkham, and he is interested in her. She's interested in him. And then he dallies a little bit, or as the English biographer said, he shilly-shallies, all right? And he doesn't get around to proposing, and she waits, and then she marries somebody else. Rats, one down. Well, he gets saved. Sorry, before he gets saved, I jumped the gun a little bit. He goes to Georgia as a missionary. I mentioned that. While he's in Georgia, he meets the daughter of the governor. I'm not the governor, Oglethorpe, but the mayor of Savannah. Her name was Sophie Hopke. And Sophie's a young girl. She is apparently very attractive. John is this eligible minister, and everybody thinks they're just perfect for each other. And Sophie is flattered by John's interest in her, and he pursues her, and they're sort of an item, and then he keeps pursuing her, and he's not willing to pull the trigger, and he never proposes. Meanwhile, there are other young men who would all like to be married to Sophie, and eventually Sophie tells him, sorry, Pastor John, I'm going to marry him. And then she marries somebody else. And John was so furious that he literally denounced them from the pulpit, which outraged everybody in Savannah. John had a horrible time in England. But anyway, 0 for 2. He gets saved, and he's extremely busy. That is, from getting saved in 1738 until 1748, he is involved in all kinds of activities. He's traveling, he's building up Methodism, he's purchasing properties. It's amazing how engaged. And so he doesn't know he'll ever get married. He's now 45. But there's this lady, and she's a Methodist women's worker. Her name's Grace, and she's perfect. I mean, she's a hard-working person, and she's helping to organize his Methodist classes and societies, and she's a women's worker par excellence, and she knows the gospel. And several times, she and John actually ride double on a horse, and there's a relationship budding here. And he thinks she's going to be perfect because Grace will know how to work right alongside me. And so he considers proposing. But John has a hard time doing that. And he kind of shilly-shallies, and he doesn't ask her, and there's some complications. Methodism at this time, as it's emerging, is kind of caricatured by the state church as much a rabble. Low-born people, commoners. Methodism is spreading among the people who are not in high society. And Grace Murray was a commoner. She was working class. And Charles Wesley and other Wesleyan pastors said, John, if you marry Grace, you're going to bring the entire movement into disrepute. University graduates with grad training and everything like you have don't marry commoners like this. You need a highborn lady. You're going to ruin things if you marry her. And John's like, but I love her and she'd be a perfect worker with me. But he drags his feet. And Grace is getting tired of it. In fact, there's another Methodist preacher pursuing her, and she's sort of equally expressing interest in both Methodist preachers. One biographer says the pattern had now been set for all John's abortive love affairs. That's an old use of the word love affair, nothing inappropriate happening. The bright beginning, the hesitation and long shilly-shallying, the exasperation of the lady and her ultimatum, quickly rescinded, but not quick enough to forestall his final renunciation. 3 times he would be upon the brink of marriage, and 3 times he would extricate himself before the decisive word had been spoken. Now, in the case of Grace, he was that close. He had a checklist of characteristics, 7 conditions a woman must satisfy, and Grace checked all 7. He even conversed with her about if God blessed them with children, what they would do with the kids, because he's not slowing down. He doesn't want her to slow down. But by this time, the Methodists have opened a school at Kingswood, and he said, when God gives us children, we can drop them off at Kingswood, and they'll receive a good training, and whenever we're through that part of England, we can stop off and visit with them. And apparently she was okay with that idea. One biographer said, John Wesley was incapable of real domesticity. He wanted a coadjutor, not a wife. That is, what he wanted was somebody to work alongside of him in building up Methodism. We only have one picture of Grace, and it's from old age, and they're not 100% sure that's her. All right, but that's all we've got. But he was falling for Grace. And then his brother Charles, who, by the way, don't think ill of Charles. Charles was a great and good man. You know, greatest hymn writer in the history of the church by far. His 8,000 hymns contain the greatest hymns that we sing. But Charles was very conservative, very devoted to the Anglican Church, and very concerned about Methodism being criticized. And he thought, John is going to ruin everything if he marries this commoner. And so Charles, to solve the problem, went to Grace. And he said, Grace, if you marry my brother, do you realize how you're going to mess things up? Marry Brother Bennett. He wants to marry you anyway. You know he does. And she said, yeah, John Bennett and I have been talking. And she went to John Bennett and did whatever women do to make sure he knew she was available. And John Bennett proposed. And the next thing John knows, Grace Bennett's married to somebody else. And he found out that Charles was behind it. It's going to take a long time for John Wesley to forgive Charles. He blamed him for losing out on the love of his life. Was she the love of his life? I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical that John would have made a good husband to Grace Murray. But in any event, 15 months later, all right, so fast forward 1 year, 3 months. He's in London. That's where the headquarters of Methodism was the Foundry, a building they bought in London and converted into a preaching center. And he was speaking on a raised platform in London. And as he starts to walk down off the platform, he trips, turns his ankle, and severely sprains it. Not going to be able to walk for a couple weeks. And a friend of his had a mutual friend. Her name was Molly Vazile. Molly, I'm sorry, I didn't show you Charles Wesley. There's Charles. That was bad, Charles. All right. I love Charles, but it's hard to, there's Molly. Yeah, no, that was not, that's Molly. All right. Behave yourselves. All right. Well, this mutual friend said, I have this friend named Molly, and she's a widow. Her husband was a banker who became a Methodist, got saved, and passed away. And she has this big old house with lots of servants and 4 children. Why don't you convalesce there? And Molly invited John to come to her house. It was all appropriate. I mean, there's people everywhere. But John rests his sore ankle at Molly's house, this nice banker's home. And they started chatting. And they enjoyed chatting. It's kind of nice. I mean, she was impressed by John. He's this famous preacher, and he liked her. very nice home. And then he brought up the possibility of matrimony and said, now if we marry, I'm going to sign a prenuptial agreement saying that I'm not laying claim to any of your money. See, because if people found out I married a rich woman, that would scandalize Methodism, so you keep your money. And John Wesley, by the way, could have been filthy rich. I mean, his publications brought in thousands of pounds, all of which he gave away. He died with barely enough money to bury him. So he was not one of these charlatan preachers. But he did not want Molly's money, but he did want to be married to Molly. And so exactly 16 days after meeting Molly Vizio, John and Molly became engaged to be married. John proposed, she accepted. Not long after that, John, 47, Molly, 41, got married. He said, well, tell us about the wedding. We have extensive journals from John Wesley. I mean, extensive journals. And the wedding is not mentioned in any of them, or at least any of them that have been translated. He invented his own languages and wrote 3 or 4 journals in languages that people have been trying to figure out in the centuries since. He was quite the genius. And some of them they've cracked, some of them they haven't cracked. But the wedding is totally overlooked. John is famous for saying, in respect of traveling abroad, the Methodist preacher who has a wife should be as though he had none. That is, you're allowed to marry, men, but not if it slows you down. Not if it slows you down. We got a great work to do, and you marry, then I expect you to keep on traveling. And after telling preachers that, he had to do it himself. Of course, he wanted to. Almost right after the wedding, word got back. In fact, she might have been sitting there. I don't know if she was at the meeting or not. But he got up in front of a bunch of Methodist preachers and said, men, I want you to understand that I've gotten married, I've taken a wife. I thought it was necessary to take up this cross for the cause of Christ, but I'm not slowing down. And Molly wasn't super excited to hear that she was a cross that he had to take up. And so for the first 4 months, things are not going well. And Molly contacts Charles, who was famous as being a very gentle. Now, I don't know if Molly knew that Charles had wrecked the marriage with Grace, but everybody liked Charles. Charles had a personality that everyone enjoyed. John's personality was, well, what I tell my students is that if John Wesley walked in right now, in about 20 minutes, we'd all be sitting in different places, and we wouldn't know how we got there. He just had this gift for organization and leadership, and people did what he said. Charles, on the other hand, was just a bundle of sweet emotions. And she went to Charles and said, John is a terrible husband. Can you help us? And so Charles went and met with them. Of course, John was still upset with Charles, but they met the 3 of them together. And after their meeting, people said, were you able to patch it up? And Charles said, there's no way to patch that up. That woman is insufferable. I couldn't be married to her for 5 minutes. I don't know why John married her. So Charles was on John's side. It wasn't looking good. At first, Molly has these 4 children. She says, I've got to watch the kids while you travel. And John takes off on these trips. And then she said, you leave me for months at a time. He said, well, then come with me. And so she went on one of the trips with him. And he arranged a carriage. You know, I mean, Grace would have ridden side saddle with him, but she arranges a carriage for Molly. And so they bumped their way for a few hours to the next town. And they're dusty roads, and it's rough. It's a carriage. And by the time she gets there, you know, she's disheveled, and her makeup's not what she wants to be, and she feels very unpresentable. And they step out of the carriage, and they're mobbed by adoring women. That is, early Methodism appealed to women about 60% more than it appealed to men. That is, the societies were often full of women who were passionate about having a better experience of Christ than what the Anglican Church was giving them. And suddenly Molly sees her husband being swarmed by all these adoring women admirers, while she herself doesn't want to see anybody because she feels so destroyed by the ride. And it was a horrible experience for her. Furthermore, she just complained. She complained about the weather. She complained about traveling conditions. She complained when enemies attacked him. She complained when friends adored him. She was self-conscious all the time. And it drove John crazy. John constitutionally really didn't complain about anything. That is, nothing bothered him. Everything bothered her. So there's Molly's side. She said, John travels constantly. I've got 4 children to raise, and he doesn't help me. There's other women. There's lots of other women. He seems to like these other women more than he does me. And there may have been, not in any kind of romantic sexual way. Nothing has ever been established. Again, they're still translating diaries, but nothing has ever been proven that John was unfaithful to her in any way, especially physically. Essentially physically. But there's all these adoring women, and in his role as the head of Methodism, he regularly wrote letters to these women. I'll come back to that. He doesn't include me in the ministry. Well, people laughed out loud when they heard her say that, because she did not try to be involved in the ministry. And I get no help with my parenting, and there's a lot of truth in that. On John's side, he said she complains if I travel without her, and she complains if I travel with her. I can't please her. She's jealous. There's no reason for her to be jealous, but she's constantly jealous, and she has no heart at all for ministry. Well, 2 incidents occurred that are rather celebrated and notorious. They're reasonably well attested. One of them is a Methodist preacher who told the rest of the Methodist preachers, and then it spread rapidly, that he visited their home, and when he did, the servant invited him in before they were ready, and there was Molly, quote, dragging him by the hair across the room. That is, John Wesley stood around 5'1", 5'2", he weighed like 115 pounds. He was a small man, and apparently Molly could handle him. Secondly, John corresponded extensively with other women. And early in their marriage, she read his mail. Every time there was a letter from a woman, she was furious about it, and she would fuss at him. John solved that problem by buying a lockable bureau. And he'd have the servants put his mail in the bureau and lock it to keep her out of his mail. Well, she got a locksmith to break into the bureau and to pull out letters from other women. Brace yourselves. This is Molly's personality. She took a bunch of the letters and she read them, and there was nothing particularly incriminating in them as they stood. So she took passages out of different letters, wove them together to look extremely incriminating, and then had it published in the London newspapers. And John was irate, as all of us would be. That is, she was determined to get him to do what she wanted. Well, 1758, 7 years into this marriage, Molly says, enough is enough. I'm leaving. And she takes the kids and she leaves. And John says, I hope I shall see your wicked face no more. That is, he took it okay. This is not the proper response, by the way. Right? John is supposed to love his wife as Christ loves the church. But she came back. That is, it's hard to feel real sorry for Molly. But the fact is, at the time, it seems that everyone took John's side. He's the great evangelist. He is the one who has all the great theology. He is the one who's doing all the great work. She is the spoiled banker's wife who refuses to be a spiritual person. And so everyone took his side. And finally, she came back. And for years, he'd return from his trips, and she'd return from her pouts. That it was back and forth. And they had a terrible relationship. Right before their 20th anniversary, 1771, John writes a long letter, I think to Charles, but I don't have that data, but he writes a long letter in which he documents 20 miserable years. She steals from my bureau. Now, if I complain to one of you that Jamie steals from my bureau, the first question you should ask is, why do you have a bureau? I thought it should be our bureau, not my bureau. But they're living his, hers, and there's no one flesh going on here. I can't invite friends over because of her irrationality, and there's some evidence for that. I feel like a prisoner in my own home, he wrote. I love this one. She wants me to give an account for everywhere I go. Husbands, wives, do you take off without telling your wife or husband where you're going? I mean, I generally tell my wife I'm about to go out and mow the lawn. I mean, I don't have to, but I know she loves me and cares about where I am, and she does the same for me. That's kind of like married life, right? Well, not for John and Molly. She wants me to give an account. Can you believe it? She shows others my private letters. Yeah. She uses fishwife's language in talking to the servants. That's what John says. And she slanders me continually, constantly. Well, this is not a healthy situation. The sad part of this, and the part where we could start crying, is that there's a lot of mutual suffering going on here. You know, one of the reasons God brings people together when he does, both in marriage and in friendship and in a church, is so we can bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. God often puts burdens on us that are just extremely heavy. Christ himself is our greatest burden bearer, but he brings people into our lives to help us. John was constantly maligned in the press. He was attacked by Anglican officials. He was attacked by theological opponents. He was attacked both metaphorically and physically as he traveled. That on many occasions he was pelted with eggs and rocks and dead cats and all kinds of gross stuff. And there were Methodist preachers who were killed while street preaching. John, of course, escaped that. But his life was threatened. At the time of his marriage, he had a bout with tuberculosis. Now, he was a generally healthy person. In fact, when he was like 87 years old, which was pretty rare in the 18th century, somebody asked, how did you live so long? He says, well, I get up and preach every morning at 5 o'clock. It's very healthful. And he did. He preached right up until the end of his life. But he went through a lot. He bore tremendous burdens of managing this rapidly expanding Methodist community. Wouldn't it have been great if he had a wife who set aside her own petty things and entered into that ministry and helped bear those burdens? On the other hand, one of Molly's 4 children died. Was John there for her? Certainly not emotionally. A second one went through a long, serious illness. And the 2 youngest, shock, shock, are going to grow up to utterly reject the faith and rebel against everything their parents stand for. Now that happens to the best of homes. You never know. Children have to make decisions. But man, is it not a surprise when these kids see this dysfunction in this home. And if she had had a husband who was there holding her hand and weeping with her and caring about her and saying, got to cancel that trip because she's more important, that could have made a big difference. 20th anniversary came, and she had had enough. She left again. 13 years since the last time she left. And John wrote what, again, you laugh or cry, January 20, this is what he wrote in his journal. January 23rd. For what cause I know not, my wife set out for Newcastle. For what cause I know not. I can't think of a single reason why she'd leave. Yeah, sure, John. She set out for Newcastle, purposing never to return. I have not, he wrote this in Latin, by the way. I'm giving you the translation. I have not left her. I have not sent her away. I shall not ask her to come back. And about a year later, she came back. And she actually went on a trip with him. And it was the same old, same old. That is, it was hard to travel back when she was in her 40s, much now in her 60s. And finally, in 1776, when John was 73 years old and Molly was 67, she left for the last time. The kids are all gone at this point. She was away from him for 5 years. In 1781, she passed away. He continued serving for 15 more years. That's all the way until he was 88. Is that a sad story or what? What do we learn from that story? Well, there's one thing that I think we dare not learn. There are certain spiritual principles embedded in the scriptures and in the way God rules the universe that we do well to align our lives with. That's the nature of biblical wisdom. One of those is that man who does not dwell with his wife in an understanding way, giving honor unto her as the weaker vessel, as heirs together of the grace of life, he should expect his prayers to be hindered. That is, your relationship with your wife and your relationship with God cannot be separated. Don't try to separate them. So if we were to draw from this, I guess you can be a lousy husband and still be a great evangelist. I think that would be the wrong lesson. God's amazing, and God can cause his gospel to prosper even when people are dysfunctional. I'm glad, because I'm dysfunctional, and I want the gospel to prosper when I teach and preach. But that's not the lesson we should learn. Right? But there are some other lessons. The first one is some people should not marry. Yeah. When I'm talking to college students, and they are desperate for a spouse. They can't be happy unless they have a spouse. I'll never be fulfilled until I have a spouse. It's like, God knows how to get people together. Do not hinge your happiness on anything but God himself. Right? And humans don't fill that void. And if you live your life saying, I got to have a spouse, Francis Asbury was one of the greatest Methodist preachers. In fact, John Wesley sent him and Thomas Coke to America, 1784, to establish Methodism in the United States. And they were incredibly successful. That is, Francis Asbury, like Wesley, is going to travel 250,000 miles on horseback. He's going to visit every colony, every state, and all the territories. He's just going to be indefatigable. Hardest worker, one of the hardest workers I've studied in church history. And he's going to see thousands of people come to Christ. And guess what he's never going to do? He's never going to get married. Francis Asbury was asked, why don't you get married? And he said, because I can't slow down. God's given me this job to do, and if I get married, I'll be a terrible husband. And therefore, he didn't get married. William Tyndale never got married. And they asked Tyndale why not. He said, because tomorrow they may catch me and kill me. Well, I wouldn't want to do that to a wife. And so he knew better than to marry. So I would beware of some type of a mentality that says, I got to have a spouse or I won't be happy. And that's idolatry. I could probably add as a little subpoint here, don't propose after 16 days. All right, that's probably also not a great idea. All right, I've known some fast ones. You know, my parents knew each other for 6 weeks and got married. And for the next 2 years, they almost killed each other. That is, the marriage lasted. They had a wonderful marriage. But
you wouldn't be here.
I wouldn't be here, and I certainly wouldn't love the Lord, humanly speaking, without what they had poured into me. But they didn't know each other very well, and getting to know each other after marriage is, I mean, everybody has to do it, but it's a challenge. Secondly, beware of a relationship with a parent that overshadows or competes with your marriage. There's a principle that counselors use called the TPT principle. Temporary. You have a temporary relationship with your children. That is, you've got 17 to 20 years to shape them as arrows to fly straight, and then you turn them loose. And while they're still your kids, you're still their parents, you can't have the same relationship you have with them. And there's another temporary relationship, and that is the relationship you have with your parents. They shape you for 18 to 20 years, and then they send you off. And both of those relationships are temporary. The relationship with your spouse is permanent. And therefore, it must take priority over parents and kids. Families, spouses who prioritize their kids or their parents over their spouse are putting landmines down that can blow up a marriage. And I'm convinced that John just spent his life looking for Susanna, and which meant he was looking for a model of himself. Third, marriage works only through mutual sacrifice. Marriage works only through mutual sacrifice. If you were to ask me, how could John and Molly's marriage have worked? Well, I ask you, could their marriage have worked? If they were both believers, the answer is yes. That marriage didn't catch God by surprise. And if somebody who's a believer, married to a believer, says, I never should have married that person, and therefore it can't work. I say, maybe you shouldn't have. Yes, it can. Because if you pursue Christ and they pursue Christ, all the other stuff can be worked out. And if John had been willing to sacrifice some of his, I gotta conquer England, and Molly had been able to sacrifice her, I've got to have everything just right or I'm going to complain about it, they might have made a glorious team. And fourthly, your spouse is your first ministry, your first responsibility before God. Now, this isn't always easy in practice. I don't mean to embarrass her, but I'm thankful that in 41 and a half years of marriage, I've never had to say, God wants me to do that, but my wife wants me to do that, and have a tug-of-war. Right? I know it's possible. I know it happens for some. And when I say the wife is the first ministry, that doesn't mean your wife can cause you to sin. And at some point you have to say, I obey God rather than man, even if the man is my spouse. What I mean by this is that if I'm going to invest my energies in a relationship, it starts in the home and then it ripples out. And I have not studied any other couples in the history of the church that were as dysfunctional as this one, because the wisdom policy is the rule. And that is that a man who is going to invest in others had better start investing at home, and a godly marriage will reverberate and multiply. Do you have comments or questions on John and Molly? I don't know what happened to the two children who did not rebel. In fact, I don't really know much about Molly's 4 kids, what happened subsequently. But do you have any questions about this story? Yes, sir.
Did Wesley ever show any regret about his kids?
I don't know.